So the clocks strike 10 here. I'm in Germany, so I'm an hour ahead of you. I'm in the future already. I'm Tatjana Schneider. I'm professor of architectural theory at the Technical University of Braunschweig, where I lead the Institute for History and Theory of Architecture in the City, more short GTAS, Geschichte und Theorie der Architektur und Stadt. So thank you very much to the Architecture Foundation for having me, especially to Alicia Pivaro for inviting me, for having me tonight. Your bedtime story on day 98 of your series will be chapter 1 from the book In Catastrophic Times, Resisting the Coming of Barbarism, written by the trained chemist and philosopher Isabelle Stengers, who authored and co-authored many books on the philosophy of science. The book tonight was written already back in 2008, and some of you might remember in the context of the global financial crisis. It was only translated from French in 2015. The copy I am reading from was published by the Open Humanities Press and translated by Andrew Goffey. So when many books published as recently as earlier this year, say January or even February 2020, might already seem to be from a different age and time, this book by Stengers, exists in the present like almost none other. Stengers, in her own introduction to the book, calls it an intervention. And intervention, of course, is a term familiar with those of us who are trained architects or practicing architects, of course. But Stengers doesn't really talk about buildings or spaces or places when she talks of interventions. For her, intervening is about, let's call it, inserting a different thought, a different idea in between other, maybe standard or normative ideas. It's about looking at things from a different angle, disrupting, even for the briefest of moments, the flow of, for example, a conversation or discussion with something that might not belong, might not seem to belong, but as she says, creates a short freezing moment. A moment that passes but will not disappear entirely because of the power it has, the power of something other, something that brings a halt, a stop, a temporary pause to business as usual. The book is exactly such an intervention, and this is why I'm reading it from it tonight. It's not a very long book, but quite a substantial one, certainly longer than the insertion of a thought in a random or not so random conversation. It makes us, or it makes me, whenever I go back to the book. And this is also, of course, one of the reasons I have it with me tonight. Stop, think, question, and talk about those questions with others. Questions that concern our climate, our planet, resistance against dominant or hegemonic modes of making, but also action in the context of change. Crucially for me, because mostly I trade with words, it is very clear on the necessity to look closely at the words we use to talk about, describe, and name what is happening around us. Which echoes in so many words, of course, also Adrian Forty, who says ever so directly that this connection of words and space is crucial for, and I quote him here, the words we use when we talk about architecture also directs the way we think of and live with buildings or space more generally. But it's back to Stengers, back to her book, and I began chapter 1, I will read, which is called Between Two Histories. Between two histories. We live in strange times. A little as we were suspended between two histories, both of which speak of a world become global. One of them is familiar to us. It has the rhythm of news from the front in the great worldwide competition and has economic growth for its arrow of time. It has the clarity of evidence with regard to what it requires and promotes, but it is marked by a remarkable confusion as to its consequences. The other, by contrast, could be called distinct with regards to what it is in the process of happening, but it is obscure with regard to what it requires, the response to give to what is in the process of happening. Clarity does not signify tranquility. At the moment when I began to write this text, the subprime crisis was already shaking the banking world, and we were learning about the non-negligible role played by financial speculation and the brutal price increases of basic foodstuffs. At the moment when I was putting the final touches to this text, which was mid-October 2008, the financial meltdown was underway, panic on the stock markets had been unleashed, and states who to that point had been kept out of the court of the powerful were suddenly called on to try to re-establish order and to save the banks. I do not know what the situation will be when this book reaches its readers. What I do know is that, amplified by the crisis, more and more numerous voices could be heard, explaining with great clarity its mechanisms, the fundamental instability of the arrangements of finance, and the intrinsic danger of what investors had put their trust in. Sure, the explanation comes afterwards, and it doesn't allow for prediction, but for the moment, all are unanimous. It will be necessary to regulate, to monitor, to indeed outlaw certain financial products. The era of financial capitalism, this predator freed from every constraint by the ultra-liberalism of the Thatcher-Reagan years, would supposedly have come to an end, the banks having to learn their real business again, that of serving industrial capitalism. Perhaps an era has come to an end, but only as an episode belonging as such to what I have called the first clear and confused history. I don't believe that I'm kidding myself in thinking that if the calm has returned when this book reaches its readers, the primordial challenge will be to relaunch economic growth. Tomorrow, like yesterday, we will be called on to accept the sacrifices required by the mobilization of everyone for this growth and to recognize the imperious necessity of reforms because the world has changed. The message addressed to all will thus remain unchanged. We have no choice. We must grit our teeth, accept that times are hard, and mobilize for the economic growth outside of which there is no conceivable solution. If we do not do so, others will take advantage of our lack of courage and confidence. In other words, it may be that the relations between protagonists will have been modified, but it will always be the same clear and confused history. The order words are clear, but the points of view on the link between those order words that mobilize and the solutions to the problems that are accumulating, growing social inequality, pollution, poisoning by pesticides, exhaustion of raw materials, groundwater depletion, etc., couldn't be more confused. That is why in Catastrophic Times, written for the most part before the catastrophic financial collapse, has not had to be rewritten. Its point of departure is different. This is because to call into question the capacity of what today is called development to respond to the problems I have cited is to push at an open door. The idea that this type of development, which has growth at its motor, could repair what it has itself contributed to creating, is not dead but has lost all obviousness. The intrinsically unsustainable character of this development, which some had announced decades ago, has henceforth become common knowledge. This in turn has created the distinct sense that another history has begun. What we know now is that if we grit our teeth and continue to have confidence in economic growth, we are going, as one says, straight to the wall. This doesn't signify in the slightest a rupture between the two histories. What they have in common is the necessity of resisting what is leading us straight to that wall. In particular, nothing of what I will write should make us forget the indispensable character of big popular mobilizations. Let us think of the WTH protests in Seattle, which are peerless for awakening the capacities to resist and to put pressure on those who demand our confidence. What makes me write this book doesn't deny this urgency, but responds to the felt necessity of trying to listen to which insists obscurely. Certainly, there are many things to demand already from the protagonists who are today defining what is possible and what isn't. Whilst struggling against those who are making the evidences of the first history reign, however, it is a matter of learning to inhabit what henceforth we know, of learning what that which is in the process of happening to us obliges us to do. If the by now common knowledge that we are heading straight to the wall demands to be inhabited, it is perhaps because its common character doesn't translate the success of a general becoming consciously aware. It therefore doesn't benefit from the words, partial knowledges, imaginative creations, or multiple convergencies that would have had such a success as their fruit, which would have empowered the voices of those who had previously been denounced as bringers of bad news, partisans of a return to the cave. As in the financial crash, which gave the proof that the financial world was vulnerable in its entirety, it is the facts that have spoken, not ideas that have triumphed. Over the last few years, one has had to cede to the evidence. What was lived as a rather abstract possibility, the global climatic disorder, has well and truly began. This, appropriately named inconvenient truth, has henceforth imposed itself. The controversy amongst scientists is over, which doesn't signify that the detractors have disappeared, but that one is only interested in them as special cases, but to be interpreted by the acquaintance with the oil lobby or for their psychosocial particularities. In France, for example, that of being a member of the Academy of Science, which makes them fractious with regard to what disturbs. Henceforth, we know, and certain observable effects are already forcing climatologists to correct their models, making the most pessimistic of predictions produced by the simulations become increasingly probable. In short, in this new era, we are no longer only dealing with a nature to be protected from the damage caused by humans, but also with a nature capable of threatening our modes of thinking and of living for good. This new situation doesn't signify that the other questions, pollution, inequalities, etc., move to the background. Instead, they find themselves correlated in a double mode. On the one hand, as I have already underlined, all call into question the perspective of growth, identified with progress, which nonetheless continues to impose itself as the only conceivable horizon. On the other hand, none can be envisaged independently of the others any longer, because each now includes global warming as one of its components. It is indeed a form of globalization that it is a matter of, with the multiple entanglements of the threats to come. One knows that new messages are already reaching the unfortunate consumer, who was supposed to have confidence in economic growth, but who is now equally invited to measure his or her ecological footprint, that is to say, to recognize the irresponsible and selfish character of his or her mode of consumption. One hears it asserted that it will be necessary to change our way of life. There's an appeal to goodwill at all levels, but the disarray of politicians is almost palpable. How is one to maintain the imperative of freeing economic growth, of winning in the grand economic competition, while the future will define this type of growth as irresponsible, even criminal? Despite this disarray, it is always the very clear logic of what I have called the first history that prevails and continues to accumulate victims. The recent victims of the financial crisis, certainly, but also and above all, the ordinary victims, sacrificed on the altar of growth to the service of which our lives are dedicated. Amongst these victims, there are those who are distant, but there are others who are closer. One thinks of those who have drowned in the Mediterranean, who preferred a probable death to the life that they would lead in their country, behind in the race of growth, and of those who, having arrived amongst us, are pursued as sans-papiers, illegal immigrants. But it isn't only a matter of others. Mobilization for growth hits our workers, submitted to intolerable imperatives of productivity, like the unemployed, targeted by policies of activation and motivation, called on to prove that they are spending their time looking for work, even forced to accept any type of job. In my country, the hunting season against the unemployed has been declared open. Public enemy number one is the cheat, who has succeeded in fabricating a life in the interstices. That this life might be active, producing joy, cooperation, or solidarity matters very little or must even be denounced. The unemployed person, who is neither ashamed nor desperate, must seek to pass unnoticed because they set a bad example, that of demobilization or desertion. Economic war, this war whose victims have no right to be honored, but are called on to find every means of returning to the front, requires all of us. This quasi-stupefying contrast between what we know and what mobilizes us had to be recalled so as to dare to put the future that is being prepared under the sign of barbarism. Not the barbarism which, for the Athenians, characterized peoples defined as uncivilized, but that which, produced by the history of which we have been so proud, was named in 1915 by Rosa Luxemburg in a text that she wrote in prison. And I quote, "Millions of proletarians of all tongues fall upon the field of dishonor, of fratricide, lacerating themselves while the song of the slave is on their lips." Luxemburg, a Marxist, affirmed that our future had as its horizon an alternative: socialism or barbarism. Nearly a century later, we haven't learned very much regarding socialism. On the other hand, we already know the sad refrain that will serve as a song on the lips of those who will survive in a world of shame, fratricide, and self-mutilation. This will be, "Unhappily, we have no choice." We have already heard this refrain so many times, most notably with regard to the sans-papiers. It signals that what had, to that point, been defined as intolerable, quasi-unthinkable, is in the process of creeping into habits, and we haven't seen anything yet. It is not for nothing that the catastrophe in New Orleans was such a big shock. What is being announced is nothing other than the possibility of a New Orleans on a global scale, wind power and solar panels for the rich, who will perhaps be able to continue to use their cars thanks to biofuels. But as for the others? This book is addressed to all of us who are living in suspense. Amongst us, there are those who know that they ought to do something, but are paralyzed by the disproportionate gap between what they are capable of and what is needed. Or they are tempted to think that it is too late, that there is no longer anything to be done, or even prefer to believe that everything will end up sorting itself out, even if they can't imagine how. But there are also those who struggle, who never gave in to the evidence of the first history, and for whom this history, productive of exploitation, of the war, of social inequalities that grow unceasingly, already defines barbarism. It is above all not a matter of making the case to them that the coming barbarism is different, as if Hurricane Katrina was itself a prefiguring of it, and is as if their struggles were as a consequence outmoded. Quite the contrary. If there was barbarism in New Orleans, it was indeed in the response that was made to Katrina. The poor abandoned, whilst the rich found shelter, and this response says nothing of the abstraction that some call human selfishness, but rather of that against which they are struggling, of that which, after having promised us to progress, demands that we accept the ineluctable character of the sacrifices imposed by global economic competition, growth, or death. If I dare to write, nevertheless, that they too are in suspense, it is because what Katrina can figure as a precursor of seems to me to require a type of engagement that they had judged it was strategically possible to do without. Nothing is more difficult than to accept the necessity of complicating a struggle that is already so uncertain, grappling with an adversary able to profit from any weakness, from any naive goodwill. I will try to make people feel that it would nevertheless be disastrous to refuse this necessity. In writing this book, I am situating myself amongst those who want to be the inheritors of a history of struggles undertaken against the perpetual state of war that capitalism makes rule. It is the question of how to inherit this history today that makes me write. If we are in suspense, some are already engaged in experiments that try to make the possibility of a future that isn't barbaric now. Those who have chosen to desert, to flee this dirty economic war, but who, in fleeing, seek a weapon, as Deleuze said. And seeking here means, in the first place, creating a life after economic growth. A life that explores connections with new powers of acting, feeling, imagining, and thinking. Those who are doing this have already chosen to modify their manner of living, effectively but also politically. They do not live in the name of a guilty concern for their carbon footprint, but experiment with what betraying the role of confident consumer that is assigned to us signifies. That is to say, what it signifies to enter into a struggle against what fabricates this assignation and to learn concretely to reinvent modes of production and of cooperation that escape from the evidences of economic growth and competition. It is to them that this book is dedicated, and more precisely to the possible that they are trying to make exist. It will not for all that be a matter of making myself into their spokesperson, of describing what they are attempting in their place. They are perfectly capable of speaking for themselves, because far from executing a return to the cave, as some have accused them, they are expert in the use of websites and networks. They have no need of me, but they do need others, like me, to work with their own means at creating the sense of what is happening to us. One should not expect from this book an answer to the question, what is to be done, because this expectation will be deceived. My trade is words, and words have power. They can imprison in doctrinal squabbles or aim at the power of order words. That is why I fear the word degrowth with its threatening arithmetic rationality, but they can also make one think, produce new connections, shake up habits. That is why I honor the invention of the names objectors to growth, economic objectors. Words don't have the power to answer the question that multiple and entangled threads of what I have called the second history on which we are embarked despite ourselves raises. But they can, and that is what this book will attempt, contribute to formulating this question in a mode that forces us to think about what the possibility of a future that is not barbaric requires. And this is the end of chapter 1. Thank you, and good night. I'm leaving you here. Bye-bye.